Millionaire loses everything due to a debt of $650 million. The poor girl makes an offer to save him. He then paralyzed. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Richard Sterling stood on the marble steps of what used to be his empire, watching as federal agents placed seizure notices on the glass doors of Sterling Industries. The building that once housed his $2.3 billion corporation now bore the cold stamp of bankruptcy court. At 52, the man who had graced Forbes covers was now worth less than nothing, $650 million less to be exact. The December wind cut through his expensive suit like a blade. He'd forgotten his coat in the rush to escape the media circus inside. Camera crews surrounded the building like vultures, their bright lights turning the grey afternoon into a theatrical nightmare. "Mr. Sterling, how does it feel to lose everything?" a reporter shouted, thrusting a microphone toward him. Richard pushed through the crowd, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the wet pavement. 24 hours ago, he'd been untouchable. Today, he couldn't afford a cup of coffee. The Pandora Investment Group had called in their debt, all of it, immediately. Something about breach of contract, hidden clauses, legal maneuvers he'd never seen coming. His lawyers had vanished like smoke when the money dried up. As he stumbled down Fifth Avenue, the familiar sights of Manhattan felt foreign. Every store window, every restaurant, every building reminded him of deals he'd made, dinners he'd hosted, a life that was rapidly becoming a memory. His phone buzzed constantly. Creditors, former friends, his ex-wife Victoria demanding answers about their daughter's college fund. The streetlights began to flicker on as evening approached. Richard found himself on a corner he'd never noticed before, despite walking these streets for 30 years. A small flower stand sat beneath a flickering neon sign, tended by a young Latina girl who couldn't have been more than 12. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore a faded winter coat that had seen better years. "Fresh flowers, sir?" she called out as he passed, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed impossible in the bitter cold. "They bring good luck." Richard almost laughed at the irony. Good luck? He'd just lost the largest personal fortune in New York history, but something in the girl's eyes stopped him. They held a wisdom that seemed far too old for her young face. "I don't think flowers can help where I'm going, kid," he said, but his feet had stopped moving. The girl studied him for a moment, tilting her head like she was reading something written on his face. "You're the man from the building," she said quietly. "The one on the news. Richard Sterling." He tensed, waiting for the judgment, the mockery, or worse, pity. Instead, she reached into a small wooden box beside her flowers and pulled out a single white rose. "My grandmother always said white roses are for new beginnings," she said, holding it out to him. "But I think maybe I can help you with more than just flowers." Richard stared at the rose, then at the girl. There was something in her expression, a certainty that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. Hope? Desperation? "Help me?" he whispered. "Kid, I owe $650 million to people who could make me disappear." "What could you possibly—" "I know exactly how much you owe," she interrupted, her voice steady and sure. "And I know who you owe it to. But more importantly, Mr. Sterling, I know something they don't. Something that could change everything." The words hung in the frigid air between them, like a promise and a threat. Richard's hand trembled as he reached for the white rose, and in that moment he realized that this 12-year-old flower vendor might be the only person in New York City who could save his life. But how could that possibly be true? Richard Sterling clutched the white rose as he followed the girl. Lucy, she'd finally told him her name, down a narrow alley behind the flower stand. The December wind howled between the buildings, but she moved with the confidence of someone who knew these streets like the back of her hand. "You're insane if you think I'm going anywhere with a 12-year-old, Richard said, though his feet kept following her. Desperation had a way of making impossible choices seem logical. "I'm 13, actually," Lucy corrected without looking back, "and you're insane if you think you have any other options right now." She stopped in front of a fire escape and began climbing. Richard hesitated at the bottom, looking up at this child who claimed she could solve his $650 million nightmare. His phone buzzed again. Another creditor, another threat. He'd received 17 death threats since this morning. "The Pandora Investment Group isn't just a hedge fund, Mr. Sterling," Lucy called down from the second-floor landing. "They're what my grandmother would have called collectors of debts that should never be paid." Something in her tone made Richard's blood run cold. He started climbing. Lucy led him to a small apartment above a bodega. The walls were covered with newspaper clippings, photographs, and what looked like financial documents connected by red string, like something from a detective movie. Richard's own photo was prominently displayed at the center of it all. "How long have you been watching me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since they first approached you about the investment 3 years ago," Lucy said, pulling out a thick manila folder. "My family has been tracking Pandora for generations. They destroyed my great-grandfather in 1987, my uncle in 2003, and now they're coming for you." She handed him a photograph, black and white, clearly old. A man in a suit stood outside a factory, holding a foreclosure notice. Richard's breath caught in his throat. The man looked exactly like him, down to the same haunted expression he'd seen in his bathroom mirror that morning. "That's my great-grandfather, Miguel Santos," Lucy said quietly. "Pandora took everything from him too. But before he died, he made me a promise. He said someday, when they came for someone who could fight back, our family would be ready." Richard stared at the photograph, then at Lucy. "You're saying this is some kind of family vendetta?" "I'm saying Pandora has been using the same playbook for 40 years, and we've been documenting every move." Lucy's eyes blazed with determination. "They make you think you're borrowing money, but you're really signing your soul away. The contract you signed, it has clauses that activate based on market conditions they control." She pulled out another document, a copy of Richard's original investment agreement with Pandora. But this version had sections highlighted in yellow that he'd never seen before. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "Does it matter? What matters is that in 72 hours they're going to demand payment, not just from you, but from everyone who ever invested in Sterling Industries. Your clients, your partners, your employees, pension funds, everyone." The room seemed to spin around Richard. "That's impossible. The bankruptcy protection means nothing when they invoke the collective liability clause you never knew you signed." Lucy's voice was steady, matter-of-fact. "Unless we stop them first." Richard sank into a chair, the weight of what she was saying crushing down on him. If Lucy was right, his financial ruin was just the beginning. Thousands of innocent people would lose everything because of his signature on a document he'd apparently never really read. "Even if what you're saying is true," he said slowly, "what could a 13-year-old possibly do against a billion-dollar hedge fund?" Lucy smiled for the first time since they'd met, and Richard saw something dangerous flash in her eyes. "Mr. Sterling, I think it's time you learned what the Santos family really does for a living." The next morning, Richard found himself in the basement of a small accounting firm in Queens, watching Lucy type rapidly on a computer that looked far too sophisticated for the modest office above them. She'd been working for 3 hours straight, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards while screens flickered with financial data, legal documents, and what appeared to be surveillance footage. "I still don't understand how you have access to all this," Richard said, nursing his 4th cup of coffee. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. "My father, Carlos Santos, isn't just an accountant," Lucy explained without taking her eyes off the screens. "He's what you might call a forensic data specialist. And my mother, Eleanor, works for the Treasury Department, officially. She pulled up a video feed showing the Pandora Investment Group's Manhattan offices. Richard watched men in expensive suits moving through glass-walled conference rooms like sharks circling prey. "My family has been building this case against Pandora for decades," Lucy continued. "Every contract they've ever written, every family they've destroyed, every legal loophole they've exploited. We have it all documented. But we needed someone with enough visibility, enough resources to make it stick in court. And you think that someone is me?" Richard laughed bitterly. "In case you haven't noticed, I don't have resources anymore." "You have something better," Lucy said, finally turning to look at him. "You have their attention. When Pandora destroys someone, they usually do it quietly. But they made a mistake with you. They made it public. Now the whole world is watching." She pulled up a news article from the Wall Street Journal. "Sterling Industries' collapse raises questions about investment practices." Below it were dozens of similar headlines from major publications. "The media thinks this is just another corporate bankruptcy," Lucy explained. "But we're going to show them it's systematic fraud. My family has been gathering evidence for 40 years, waiting for the right moment. This is it." Richard stared at the screens, processing what she was telling him. "So this whole time you've been planning to use me as bait?" "No," Lucy said firmly. "We've been planning to save you and everyone like you." She pressed a key, and a new document appeared on screen, a legal brief that was over 300 pages long. The title read, "Santos v. Pandora Investment Group, a RICO case for systematic financial fraud spanning 4 decades." "This case has been 40 years in the making," Lucy said. "My great-grandfather started gathering evidence the day they took his factory. My grandfather continued it, my father perfected it, and now it's my turn to finish it." Richard felt something he hadn't experienced in days, hope, but it was mixed with a growing dread as he realized the magnitude of what Lucy's family had been planning. "If you file this lawsuit, they'll come after your family," he said. "These people don't just destroy businesses, they destroy lives." Lucy's expression hardened. "They already destroyed our lives, Mr. Sterling. They just don't know we survived it." She handed him a business card. "Santos and Associates, Financial Justice Advocates." The address listed was the same building they were sitting in. "Tomorrow morning, we file the lawsuit," Lucy said, "but tonight you need to make a choice. You can walk away, declare bankruptcy, and let Pandora move on to their next victim, or you can help us end this once and for all." Richard looked at the card, then at Lucy, then at the screens full of evidence that could potentially save not just his life, but the lives of countless others. But as he opened his mouth to answer, every screen in the room suddenly went black. Then slowly, a message appeared in red letters. "We know where you are." The message on the screens disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, but the damage was done. Lucy's hands were already flying across the keyboard, executing what looked like a well-rehearsed emergency protocol. "They found us," she said, her voice remarkably calm for a 13-year-old. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they get here." "They?" Richard asked. But Lucy was already packing equipment into military-style cases with practiced efficiency. "Pandora doesn't just use lawyers and accountants, Mr. Sterling. They have other resources." Lucy glanced at him as she closed the last case. "People who make problems disappear permanently." The implication hit Richard like a physical blow. "Are you saying they kill people?" "I'm saying my Uncle Miguel wasn't in a car accident." Lucy's voice was steady, but Richard could see the pain flash across her young face. "And my grandmother didn't die of natural causes." A sound from upstairs made them both freeze, footsteps heavy and deliberate. Lucy grabbed Richard's arm and pulled him toward what looked like a supply closet. Inside, she pressed a hidden button, and the back wall slid away to reveal a tunnel. "Emergency exit," she whispered. "My father had this built when I was 8. As they crawled through the narrow tunnel, Richard could hear voices above them, professional, efficient, speaking in clipped sentences about securing the area and retrieving all materials. These weren't repo men or even federal agents. These were people who sounded like they'd done this before. The tunnel emerged in the basement of a neighboring building. Lucy led him up a service stairway to a parking garage where a beat-up Honda Civic waited. She handed him the keys. "You know how to drive, right?" she asked. "Of course I know how to." "Wait, where are we going?" Richard demanded as they got in the car. "Somewhere safe. My family has safe houses throughout the city." Lucy was checking her phone, scrolling through what looked like encrypted messages. "But first, we need to warn my parents." As Richard started the car, Lucy's phone rang. She answered in rapid Spanish, her face growing paler with each word. When she hung up, she was quiet for a long moment. "What is it?" Richard asked. "They took my father." Lucy's voice was barely audible. "Picked him up outside his office 2 hours ago. My mother is in hiding." Richard felt sick. This innocent family was being targeted because of their connection to him, because they'd tried to help him. "Lucy, we have to call the police." "The police?" Lucy looked at him like he'd suggested calling Santa Claus. "Mr. Sterling, Pandora has been operating for 40 years without getting caught. You think they don't have connections in law enforcement?" She directed him through a series of turns that took them deep into Brooklyn. As they drove, Lucy explained more about her family's history with Pandora. Her great-grandfather had been a successful factory owner in the 1980s until Pandora convinced him to take out massive loans for expansion opportunities. When the hidden terms activated, they'd taken everything: the factory, the house, even his children's college funds. "But he was smart," Lucy said. "Before they could silence him completely, he copied all the documents. He spent the rest of his life building a case, teaching my grandfather everything he learned. My grandfather taught my father, and my father taught me." "Why you?" Richard asked. "Why not leave this for the adults to handle?" Lucy was quiet for so long that Richard thought she hadn't heard him. Finally, she spoke. "Because I'm the one they won't see coming. They expect angry men seeking revenge. They don't expect a 13-year-old girl with a photographic memory and access to her mother's Treasury Department clearance." As they pulled up to a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, Richard realized he was dealing with something far more complex than a simple debt collection. This was a war that had been going on for decades, and he'd just been drafted as the latest soldier. But as they walked up to the front door, Richard noticed something that made his blood run cold. The door was standing slightly open, and there were muddy footprints on the porch that were far too large to belong to anyone in Lucy's family. The house was empty, but the signs of struggle were unmistakable. Overturned furniture, scattered papers, and worst of all, drops of blood on the kitchen floor. Lucy stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the chaos that had once been her family's safe house. "Lucy," Richard said gently, "we need to leave, now." But she wasn't listening. She was staring at something on the kitchen table, a single red rose lying next to a note written in Spanish. Lucy picked up the note with trembling hands, read it, then crumpled it into a ball. "What does it say?" Richard asked. "It's from my mother," Lucy whispered. "She's alive. But they have her too." Richard felt the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. This family had risked everything to help him, and now they were paying the price. "Lucy, I'm sorry. I never wanted—" "It's not your fault," Lucy interrupted, but her voice was hollow. "This was always going to happen. We knew the risks." She walked to what looked like a family photo on the mantel and pressed something behind the frame. A section of the wall slid away, revealing another hidden room filled with more equipment and documents than the office they'd fled from. "My mother left something for us," Lucy said, pulling out a small video camera. She connected it to a laptop, and Elena Santos's face appeared on screen. Even through the recording, Richard could see the intelligence and determination in her eyes, the same look he'd noticed in Lucy. "If you're watching this," Elena's recorded voice said in accented English, "then Pandora has made their move against our family. Lucy, my brave girl, everything we've worked for comes down to the next 24 hours. Lucy's hand found Richard's as they watched the recording together. "Richard Sterling," Elena continued, looking directly into the camera as if she could see him, "by now you know this isn't just about your debt. Pandora has been systematically destroying families for 4 decades, always staying just within the bounds of legal grey areas. But they made a mistake with you. They got greedy." The video showed Elena holding up a document that made Richard's heart stop. It was his original investment contract with Pandora, but not the version he'd signed. This one had additional pages, clauses he'd never seen, and most importantly, a signature that wasn't his. "They forged your signature on the supplemental terms," Elena explained. "The clauses that activated your debt obligations, you never agreed to them, which means everything they've done to you is based on fraud." Richard stared at the screen in disbelief. "That's impossible. I was there when I signed." "You signed a different document," Eleanor's recorded voice continued, as if anticipating his objection. "What you signed was a standard investment agreement. What they filed in court was this forgery. Lucy knows where to find the original document you actually signed." Lucy paused the video and looked at Richard with eyes that suddenly seemed far older than 13. "Mr. Sterling, there's something else you need to know about my family." "What?" "We're not just accountants and Treasury Department employees." Lucy took a deep breath. "My mother is Elena Santos Rodriguez. She's an undercover federal agent who's been investigating financial crimes for the past 15 years. Everything she's done, marrying my father, having me, building this case against Pandora, it's all been part of a long-term operation." The words hit Richard like a physical blow. "You're saying your mother is a federal agent, that this whole thing is some kind of sting operation?" "Not exactly," Lucy said carefully. "She started the investigation because of what happened to our family. But yes, she's been working with the FBI for years to build a case against Pandora that would finally stick." Richard slumped against the wall, overwhelmed. Nothing was what it seemed. The sweet flower vendor wasn't just a brave kid. She was the daughter of a federal agent. The family helping him wasn't just seeking justice. They were part of an official investigation. "So what does that make me?" he asked. "Bait? An unwitting informant?" Lucy's expression softened. "It makes you the key witness in the biggest financial fraud case in U.S. history." She pressed play on the video again, and Elena's voice filled the room one more time. "If something happens to me and Carlos, Lucy knows what to do. She has memorized every detail of this case, every piece of evidence, every legal strategy. She is not just our daughter. She is the backup plan we prayed we'd never need to use." The video ended, leaving them in silence. Outside, the sound of car engines suggested they were no longer alone. "Lucy," Richard said urgently, "tell me you have another tunnel in this house." Lucy smiled grimly. "Mr. Sterling, by tomorrow morning, you're either going to be completely free or completely dead. But first, we need to get to the courthouse." The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan loomed against the grey dawn sky as Richard and Lucy approached through a service entrance. They'd spent the night in the subway tunnels, moving through maintenance passages that Lucy seemed to know by heart. Richard's expensive suit was now torn and dirty, but for the first time in days, he felt like he had a fighting chance. "My mother hid the original documents in a safety deposit box," Lucy explained as they climbed the service stairs. "But the only way to access them legally is through a federal warrant. And the only way to get that warrant is to file a formal complaint with evidence of fraud." They reached the clerk's office just as it opened. Lucy pulled out a briefcase that seemed impossibly heavy for someone her size and began arranging documents on the counter with the precision of a seasoned lawyer. "I need to file a federal RICO complaint," she told the startled clerk. "Santos vs. Pandora Investment Group, with Richard Sterling as the primary witness." The clerk looked from Lucy to Richard with obvious confusion. "Little girl, you can't just—" "I can, under emergency provisions of Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 1961, Lucy recited from memory. "When criminal enterprise poses immediate threat to witness safety and evidence preservation, is time critical. My mother, Elena Santos Rodriguez, is a federal agent whose badge number is 4471 Delta 9. She handed over a badge and identification that made the clerk's eyes widen. Richard realized he was watching a 13-year-old execute a plan that had been years in the making. "The complaint needs to be filed before 9 a.m., Lucy continued. "At 9:15, Pandora is scheduled to activate collective liability clauses affecting 17,000 investors across 6 states. We have," she checked her watch, "43 minutes. As the clerk frantically made copies and stamped documents, Lucy pulled Richard aside. "There's something in these papers that even my mother didn't know," she whispered. "I found it last night while you were sleeping." She showed him a document buried deep in the stack, a corporate filing from 1985. Richard's blood turned to ice as he read the names listed as founding partners of Pandora Investment Group. The first name was Victoria Sterling, his ex-wife. "That's impossible," Richard breathed. "Victoria wasn't even in finance back then. She was a kindergarten teacher when we met." "Look at the address listed for her," Lucy said quietly. The address was the same Manhattan apartment where Victoria had been living when Richard first met her in 1987, 2 years after Pandora was founded. The same apartment where she'd told him she was just a simple teacher looking for love. "She's been part of this from the beginning," Lucy said. "Your marriage, your business, everything, it was all planned." Richard felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. His 20-year marriage had been a lie. Victoria hadn't just divorced him, she'd been systematically positioning herself to destroy him for decades. "The timing of your divorce 3 years ago," Lucy continued, "it wasn't coincidence. She needed to distance herself legally before Pandora made their final move. That's why she insisted on keeping half of everything in liquid assets." Richard's phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Victoria. "I'm sorry it had to end this way, Richard, but some debts can only be paid in blood." Lucy saw the message over his shoulder. "Mr. Sterling, we need to—" The lights in the courthouse suddenly went out. Emergency power kicked in a moment later, bathing everything in an eerie red glow. Through the windows, Richard could see black SUVs surrounding the building. "They're here," Lucy said simply. "We have 37 minutes to get this complaint filed and get you to safety." The clerk was still stamping documents when armed men in tactical gear burst through the main entrance. But Lucy was already moving, grabbing Richard's arm and pulling him toward what looked like a janitor's closet. "Lucy," Richard said as they ran, "if Victoria has been planning this for 20 years, how long have you and your family really been watching me?" Lucy paused at the closet door, her hand on the handle. When she looked back at him, her expression was impossible to read. "Mr. Sterling," she said quietly, "what if I told you that my family didn't start watching you 3 years ago when you signed with Pandora?" "What do you mean?" Lucy opened the door to reveal not a janitor's closet, but another stairway leading down into darkness. "What if I told you we've been protecting you your entire life?" The hidden stairway led to a network of maintenance tunnels that ran beneath the entire courthouse complex. As they descended, Lucy's words echoed in Richard's mind. "We've been protecting you your entire life." "I don't understand," Richard said as they moved through the narrow corridors lit by Lucy's flashlight. "How could your family have been protecting me before I even knew Pandora existed?" Lucy stopped at a heavy steel door marked with federal warnings. She punched in a code, and the door opened to reveal a sophisticated control room filled with monitors, communication equipment, and filing cabinets that stretched from floor to ceiling. "Because Pandora didn't choose you randomly, Mr. Sterling," Lucy said, flipping on the lights. "They've been planning your destruction since the day you were born." She pulled out a thick file labeled Sterling, Richard James, Subject Protection, 1971-2024. Richard's hands trembled as he opened it to find photographs of himself as a child, school records, even medical records from when he was 5 years old. "Your father, James Sterling, was Pandora's first major target," Lucy explained. "He invented a financial algorithm in 1970 that could predict market crashes with 97% accuracy. Pandora wanted that algorithm, but your father refused to sell." Richard stared at a newspaper clipping from 1971. "Local businessman dies in apparent heart attack." Below it was a photograph of his father, a man Richard barely remembered. "They killed him," Richard whispered, "made it look natural. But my great-grandfather Miguel witnessed the whole thing. He was your father's business partner." Lucy's voice was gentle but firm. "After your father died, Pandora tried to claim rights to the algorithm through some legal maneuvering. But your father had been smart. He'd hidden the only copies." Lucy pulled out another document, a handwritten letter in Spanish with an English translation attached. "My great-grandfather made a deathbed promise to protect you until you were old enough to reclaim what was rightfully yours." "What do you mean, reclaim?" Richard asked. Lucy walked to one of the filing cabinets and pulled out a small metal box. Inside was an old computer disk and a letter sealed with wax. "Your father's algorithm. The real reason Pandora has spent 50 years trying to destroy you isn't about the money you owe them. It's about preventing you from ever discovering your inheritance." The weight of revelation was staggering. His entire life, the business success, the marriage to Victoria, even the debt that had brought him to ruin, had all been orchestrated to keep him from learning about his father's work. "Every major decision in your life has been influenced by our protection," Lucy continued. "When you got into Columbia instead of MIT, that was us redirecting your acceptance letters. When you chose finance over computer science, that was us placing the right counselor in your path. When you met Victoria was part of your plan too," Richard interrupted. Lucy's expression darkened. "No, Victoria was Pandora's countermove. They realized we were protecting you, so they placed her in your life to monitor and eventually destroy you from within." Richard felt sick. "So my entire life has been some kind of chess game between your family and Pandora?" "Not a game," Lucy said firmly. "A war. And you're the prize they've been fighting over." Suddenly, alarms began blaring throughout the facility. Red lights flashed as automated voices announced, facility breach, initiate emergency protocols." Lucy was already moving, grabbing equipment and files with practiced efficiency. "They found us again," she said, "but this time we're ready for them." She handed Richard a small device that looked like a combination phone and computer. "Everything you need to know about your father's algorithm is on here. If something happens to me, get this to Judge Patricia Morrison at the Second Circuit Court. She's been waiting 50 years to see justice for your father. Lucy, what are you planning?" Richard asked as she led him to yet another hidden passage. "I'm planning to end this war," she said, "but first you need to know the whole truth about who you really are." Judge Patricia Morrison's chambers in the Second Circuit Court looked like a fortress. The 78-year-old jurist sat behind her massive oak desk, studying the device Lucy had given Richard with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. "James Sterling," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "I wondered if this day would ever come." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Lucy sat beside him, having somehow convinced courthouse security that a 13-year-old belonged in a federal judge's private chambers. "You knew my father?" "Dashard, I was a young prosecutor in 1971 when your father came to the FBI with evidence that a new investment firm was planning to manipulate markets using insider information," Judge Morrison explained. "We were building a case against them when your father died." She handed Richard a photograph of himself as a 5-year-old boy, standing next to a man he barely remembered. "This was taken the day before your father's death. He'd come to give me something for safekeeping, something he said was for Richard when he's old enough to change the world." Judge Morrison opened a safe behind her desk and pulled out an envelope that looked identical to the one Lucy had shown him. "Your father knew they were coming for him. He spent his last week making arrangements for your protection." "The Santos family," Richard said. "Miguel Santos was more than your father's business partner," Judge Morrison confirmed. "He was his best friend. When your father died, Miguel made sure you'd be raised by people who would keep you safe while keeping you away from the financial world long enough for Pandora to think you were no threat." Richard felt pieces of his life clicking into place like a puzzle he'd never known he was solving. My adoptive parents, they were part of this too? The Sterlings were good people who wanted to give a child a loving home, Judge Morrison said gently. "But yes, Miguel helped arrange the adoption. He made sure you grew up in Ohio, far from New York's financial district, with parents who would encourage you to be anything except a financier." "But I ended up in finance anyway," Richard pointed out. Lucy spoke up. "Because Pandora realized what we were doing. When you were 18, they started their own campaign to push you into their world. That's when they first planted Victoria in your life." Judge Morrison nodded gravely. "We tried to prevent it, but Pandora had resources we couldn't match. By the time you graduated college, they had effectively taken control of your path." She activated the device Lucy had given Richard, and the screen displayed complex financial formulas and algorithms that seemed to predict market movements with impossible accuracy. "Your father's algorithm doesn't just predict crashes," Judge Morrison explained. "It predicts manipulation. Every artificial bubble, every orchestrated collapse, every natural market correction that benefits certain parties. This algorithm can identify them all." Richard stared at the screen, beginning to understand the magnitude of what his father had created. This would expose every financial crime of the past 50 years. "Including Pandora's entire operation," Lucy added. "Every family they've destroyed, every fortune they've stolen, every life they've ruined. It's all in the data patterns." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Richard, your father didn't just leave you an inheritance. He left you a weapon powerful enough to bring down the entire shadow financial system that's been operating in this country for decades." "But why me?" Richard asked. "Why not just give it to the FBI 50 years ago?" "Because in 1971, we didn't have the computing power to fully utilize it," Judge Morrison said. "Your father knew that by the time you came of age, technology would have advanced enough to make his algorithm truly effective." Lucy's phone buzzed with an urgent message. Her face went pale as she read it. "What is it?" Richard asked. "My parents," Lucy said quietly. "Pandora just released a statement saying they've been arrested for federal crimes. They're claiming my family has been running an elaborate fraud scheme for 40 years. Judge Morrison's expression hardened. "It's starting. Pandora is making their final move." She handed Richard a federal court order. "I'm placing you in protective custody and authorizing the immediate implementation of your father's algorithm to freeze all Pandora-related assets pending investigation." "Will that work?" Richard asked. Judge Morrison smiled grimly. "Richard, Your father's algorithm doesn't just expose financial crimes, it prevents them. Once it's activated, Pandora won't be able to move a single dollar without triggering federal oversight. But as she reached for her phone to issue the order, every light in the building went out. In the darkness, Lucy's voice was steady but urgent. Judge Morrison, how fast can you run? Denial, the emergency lighting cast eerie shadows through Judge Morrison's chambers as the sound of boots echoed in the corridors outside. Lucy was already helping the 78-year-old judge gather essential documents, while Richard stood frozen, still processing everything he'd learned about his father's legacy. They've cut the building's main power to disable security systems, Lucy explained, stuffing papers into a briefcase with military precision. We have maybe 3 minutes before they reach this floor. Judge Morrison moved with surprising agility for her age, grabbing a small device from her safe that looked like a sophisticated radio. Federal Marshal Emergency Channel, she said into it. This is Judge Morrison, code Alpha 77. I have a federal witness under immediate threat in Chambers 1847. The response was immediate. Judge Morrison, this is Marshal Williams. We show no federal protection order for your location. Judge Morrison's face went white. That's impossible. I issued the order 20 minutes ago. Lucy grabbed the radio. Marshal Williams, this is Lucy Santos, federal case 4471 Delta 9. Check your emergency protocols for Pandora investigation. There was a long pause. Negative on any case under that designation. Ma'am, you need to identify yourself and explain your presence in federal chambers. Richard felt the blood drain from his face. They've gotten to the marshals too. Not the marshals, Judge Morrison said grimly. The system. Pandora has been infiltrating federal databases for years. They've probably erased every record of our investigation. And the sound of boots was getting closer. Lucy pulled out her phone and started typing rapidly. I'm uploading everything to a secure server my mother set up. If we don't make it out of here, at least the evidence will survive. What about my parents? Richard asked. If they've been arrested. Your adoptive parents are safe, Judge Morrison assured him. Miguel Santos made sure they were never directly involved. They genuinely believe they adopted an orphan from a car accident. Lucy finished her upload and grabbed Richard's arm. We need to move, now. Judge Morrison led them to a section of her chambers that Richard hadn't noticed before. Behind a bookshelf was a small elevator that looked like it hadn't been used in decades. Emergency judicial evacuation route, she explained as they crowded into the tiny space. Built during the Cold War in case federal judges needed to be extracted during a Soviet attack. The elevator descended far deeper than Richard had expected, finally opening into what looked like a subway maintenance tunnel. Judge Morrison moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who'd used this route before. How often do federal judges need to escape through secret tunnels? Richard asked. More often than the public realizes, Judge Morrison replied, especially when we're dealing with cases that threaten powerful interests. They emerged 15 minutes later in the basement of a building that Lucy identified as another Santos family safe house. But as they climbed the stairs, Richard noticed something that made his heart sink. The walls were covered with photographs and documents, but they were all about him. Pictures from his childhood, his wedding to Victoria, his business successes, even candid shots from just days ago. The entire house was a shrine to his life. Lucy, he said slowly, how long has your family really been watching me? Lucy stopped climbing and turned to face him. In the dim light, she looked far older than 13. Mr. Sterling, there's something I haven't told you about my family. What now? Richard asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Miguel Santos wasn't just your father's business partner, Lucy said quietly. He was your father's brother. Miguel Santos was really Miguel Sterling. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. You're saying, I'm your cousin, Lucy said simply. Everything my family has done for the past 50 years, we did because you're family. And family protects family. Judge Morrison placed a gentle hand on Richard's shoulder. Your father had 2 sons, Richard. You and Miguel's boy, who was born 3 months after you. When your father died, Miguel changed his name to Santos to protect both families from Pandora. Richard stared at Lucy, seeing for the first time the resemblance he should have noticed immediately. The shape of her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, even the way she stood. It was all familiar because he saw it in the mirror every morning. The boy who was Miguel's son, Richard whispered. Where is he now? Lucy's expression was carefully neutral. He grew up to be my father, Carlos Santos, which means the man Pandora captured isn't just our family's financial specialist. He's my brother, Richard finished. Judge Morrison nodded. And now that Pandora knows the truth about your family connections, they'll use Carlos as leverage to force you to give up your father's algorithm. Lucy's phone buzzed with a message that made her face go pale. She showed it to Richard. A photo of a man who looked remarkably like Richard, tied to a chair in what appeared to be a warehouse. Below the photo was a simple message: the algorithm for your brother's life, 1 hour. But as Richard stared at the photo of the brother he'd never known he had, he noticed something in the background that made him smile for the first time in days. Carlos Santos wasn't being held prisoner. He was surrounded by federal agents, and he was smiling. The warehouse in the photo wasn't a prison. It was a command center. As Richard, Lucy, and Judge Morrison watched through high-definition monitors in the Santos family's real headquarters, Carlos Santos stood free among a team of federal agents, coordinating what appeared to be a massive operation. I don't understand, Richard said, staring at the screens showing federal agents surrounding Pandora offices in 6 different cities. I thought they captured him. They did, Lucy said with a grin that reminded Richard powerfully of himself as a child. They just didn't realize he wanted to be captured. Elena Santos stepped out of the shadows, very much alive and wearing an FBI jacket. Hello, Richard, she said warmly. I'm sorry for the deception, but we needed Pandora to believe they were winning. Richard felt like he was drowning in revelations. The blood in the safe house, your capture, the threatening messages, all part of the operation, Elena confirmed. We've been building this case for 40 years, but we needed Pandora to commit their final crime before we could move. They had to actually activate those fraudulent contract clauses and attempt to collect the $650 million debt. Judge Morrison was watching the screens with obvious satisfaction. Federal financial crimes become RICO predicates when they're part of a pattern spanning multiple decades, but we needed them to complete the pattern. Lucy pulled up a new screen showing financial transactions happening in real time. Right now, as we speak, Pandora is attempting to collect from all the investors who trusted Sterling Industries. Every electronic transfer, every forged document, every illegal collection attempt, it's all being recorded as evidence. But the 17,000 investors who could lose everything, Richard protested. Their retirement funds, their children's college money are all protected, Elena said, showing him another screen. Your father's algorithm isn't just about prediction, it's about prevention. The moment Pandora tries to access those funds, the algorithm triggers automatic federal holds. Richard watched in amazement as red flags appeared across the financial display every time Pandora attempted a transaction. The algorithm was working exactly as his father had designed it, protecting innocent people by exposing criminal activity in real time. So the debt was never real, Richard asked. Oh, the debt is real, Carlos Santos said, joining them via video link from his command center. But the contract you signed never authorized it. Pandora has been using forged documents for decades, but they finally got greedy enough to make mistakes we could prove in court. On another screen, Richard watched Victoria Sterling being led away in handcuffs from her Manhattan apartment. The sight should have given him satisfaction, but instead he felt only sadness for the 20 years of his life that had been built on lies. "She really never loved me," he said quietly. Lucy touched his arm gently. "No. But that doesn't mean the love you felt wasn't real, and it doesn't mean your life was wasted." Eleanor pulled up another display showing the scope of Pandora's operations. They've stolen approximately $847 million from 247 families over 4 decades. Every penny is being recovered as we speak. "What about the families they destroyed before there was money to recover?" Richard asked, thinking of Miguel Santos losing his factory in 1987. "Federal Victim Compensation Fund," Judge Morrison explained. "Plus, criminal penalties from Pandora's seized assets. Every family they've hurt will receive full restitution, plus damages." Richard felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening, and my father's algorithm made all this possible. "Your father was a genius," Carlos said from the screen, "but he was also a father who wanted to protect his son. The algorithm wasn't just about exposing financial crimes, it was about ensuring you'd never be vulnerable to them." Lucy handed Richard a final document, the original partnership agreement between James Sterling and Miguel Santos from 1970. At the bottom was a provision Richard had never seen before. In the event of the death of either partner, all intellectual property rights shall be held in trust for their children until such time as those children can work together to claim their inheritance. "Your father and my grandfather weren't just business partners," Lucy explained. "They were planning to change the entire financial system. The algorithm was just the beginning." "What do you mean?" Richard asked. Elena smiled. "James Sterling didn't just create a way to detect financial fraud. He created a framework for preventing it entirely. A system where every financial transaction could be verified for legitimacy in real time. Imagine a world where companies like Pandora couldn't exist," Carlos added, "where financial crimes were detected and prevented automatically, where ordinary families couldn't be tricked into predatory investments." Richard stared at the screens showing Pandora's empire crumbling in real time, executives being arrested, assets being frozen, victims being notified of their impending compensation. His father's 50-year-old algorithm was dismantling one of the largest criminal enterprises in American history. "So what happens now?" he asked. Lucy's expression grew serious. "Now comes the hard part. We have to decide whether to just use the algorithm to prosecute financial crimes or to implement it system-wide to prevent them entirely." "What's the difference?" The difference," Judge Morrison said gravely, "is that implementing it system-wide would essentially revolutionize the entire global financial system. It would prevent fraud, but it would also make it impossible for governments and corporations to hide questionable financial activities." Richard looked around at his newfound family, his cousin Lucy, his brother Carlos, his sister-in-law Eleanor, and realized they were offering him the chance to complete his father's life work. But as he prepared to answer, alarms began blaring again, and a new message appeared on all the screens simultaneously. "System breach. Pandora failsafe activated. All data will be deleted in 60 seconds. The countdown timer appeared on every screen. 59, 58, 57, 50 years of evidence, thousands of victim files, and Richard's father's revolutionary algorithm, all about to be destroyed by Pandora's final failsafe." "They built a dead man's switch into their system," Carlos said urgently from his command center. "If their operation gets exposed, they destroy everything." Lucy was already at the computers, her fingers flying across multiple keyboards simultaneously. "I can try to stop it, but I need the master override code." "What master override code?" Richard asked. Elena pulled out her phone, speaking rapidly to federal tech teams. Every system has administrative access, but Pandora's code would be something only the original founders would know. Richard felt a chill as he realized what they needed. Victoria, she's one of the founding partners. She would know the code. Victoria is in federal custody, Judge Morrison said. She's not going to help us save evidence that will convict her. The timer showed 43 seconds remaining. On the screens, Richard could see critical files beginning to disappear. Financial records, victim testimonies, proof of Pandora's crimes vanishing one by one. "Wait," Lucy said suddenly, her hands stopping over the keyboard. "Mr. Sterling, what was your father's favorite phrase? Something he used to say when you were little?" Richard's mind raced. He had so few memories of his father. I don't remember much. I was only 5 when he died." "Think," Eleanor urged. "Sometimes the most important things are hidden in the smallest memories." 32 seconds remaining. Richard closed his eyes, trying to remember the man he'd barely known. Suddenly a fragment came back to him, his father tucking him into bed, always ending with the same words. "Tomorrow will be better because we make it better," Richard said. He said it every night. Lucy immediately started typing. The phrase as a password failed. She tried variations, combinations, everything she could think of. 18 seconds remaining. "It's not working," Lucy said desperately. Richard watched the timer count down and felt the weight of 40 years of family sacrifice about to be lost forever. His father's work, Miguel's dedication, Carlos and Elena's undercover operation, Lucy's courage, all for nothing. Then he remembered something else. Not words, but numbers. His father teaching him to count in Spanish, laughing as 5-year-old Richard struggled with the pronunciation. "Lucy, try the phrase in Spanish," he said. "But use the numbers instead of words. Tomorrow will be better because we make it better. Mañana será mejor porque lo hacemos mejor." "That's too long for a password," Lucy said, but she was already typing something different. 7 seconds remaining. "Not the whole phrase," Richard said urgently. "Just the numbers. In Spanish. Tomorrow. Mañana. May, none, A-N-A, but as numbers on a phone keypad." Lucy's eyes lit up with understanding. She typed rapidly. 626262. 3 seconds remaining. The screens flickered. For a moment, everything went dark. Then, slowly, the data began reappearing. Files restored themselves, evidence reconstructed, 40 years of documentation returning from the digital grave. "It worked," Elena breathed, but Lucy was staring at something else on her screen, something that made her face go pale. "Mr. Sterling, there's one more file that just unlocked. Something with your father's highest security clearance." She opened the file, and Richard's world shifted again. It was a video recording clearly made in 1971, showing his father speaking directly into the camera. "If you're watching this, Richard," his father's voice said across 5 decades, "then the algorithm worked, the family stayed safe, and Pandora has finally been stopped. But son, there's one more thing you need to know." The video showed James Sterling holding a baby, Richard himself, at 6 months old. "This algorithm, this whole system I've built, it wasn't really about stopping Pandora. It was about making sure you'd have the tools to build something better. The financial world you're going to inherit is broken, son. People can't trust banks, can't trust investments, can't trust that their money will be safe from predators like Pandora." James Sterling looked directly into the camera with eyes that were unmistakably Richard's own. "So, I'm leaving you more than just evidence of crimes. I'm leaving you the blueprints for a financial system where ordinary people can't be cheated, where trust is built into the technology itself, where families like the Santos family won't have to spend their lives fighting monsters in the shadows." The video showed technical specifications, architectural diagrams, and implementation plans for what appeared to be a completely new type of financial network. This is your real inheritance, Richard. Not revenge against Pandora, revolution, a chance to rebuild the entire system from the ground up. The video ended, leaving them all in stunned silence. He designed a replacement for the entire banking system, Richard whispered. Carlos appeared on the video link, having watched the same recording from his command center. Brother, I think our father just handed us the keys to changing the world. But before Richard could respond, Judge Morrison's phone rang with news that made them all realize their fight was far from over. That was the Attorney General, she said grimly. Pandora wasn't just a criminal enterprise. They were being used by foreign governments to destabilize the American financial system. And now that we've exposed them, those governments are preparing to activate their backup plans. Richard looked around at his family, his real family, and realized that stopping Pandora had been just the beginning of the battle. But for the first time in his life, he wasn't facing that battle alone. 6 months later, Richard Sterling stood in the same courthouse where his world had nearly ended, but everything was different now. The man who had once lost $650 million was about to announce the launch of the Sterling Santos Financial Protection Network, a revolutionary system that would make predatory lending impossible. Are you ready for this? Lucy asked, adjusting his tie with the care of a daughter preparing her father for the most important moment of his life. At 14 now, she had grown into her role as the family's technical genius, but she still sold flowers on weekends because, as she said, it keeps me grounded. I'm terrified, Richard admitted, looking out at the packed courtroom filled with journalists, federal officials, and representatives from banks around the world. What if it doesn't work? What if we're wrong about changing everything? Carlos placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. Dad wasn't wrong 50 years ago, and we're not wrong now. Every simulation, every test, every projection shows the same result. Financial fraud becomes impossible when every transaction is verified in real time. Elena handed Richard a small device, the same one that had saved his life 6 months ago, now upgraded into the command center for the most ambitious financial reform in human history. The foreign governments that were backing Pandora have already started implementing similar systems in their own countries, she said. We're not just changing America, we're starting a global revolution. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of federal trials, congressional hearings, and technology development. Pandora's executives were serving life sentences. Their seized assets had compensated every victim with interest, and Victoria had testified against her former partners in exchange for a reduced sentence. But all of that had been just the cleanup. The real work had been building James Sterling's vision into reality. Ladies and gentlemen, Judge Morrison announced to the packed courtroom, we are here today to witness the implementation of the Sterling Financial Verification Protocol, a system that will fundamentally change how financial institutions operate in America. Richard stepped up to the podium, looking out at faces that ranged from skeptical to hopeful. In the front row sat Mrs. Chen, whose retirement savings had been stolen by Pandora 20 years ago. Next to her was David Rodriguez, a young father who had nearly lost his home to predatory lending. Behind them were dozens of other families whose lives had been destroyed by financial fraud. My father, James Sterling, believed that ordinary people shouldn't have to be financial experts to protect themselves from criminals. Richard began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. He believed that technology could create trust where human institutions had failed. He activated the device Elena had given him, and screens throughout the courtroom lit up with real-time displays of financial transactions happening across the country. But now, instead of hidden fees and predatory clauses, every transaction showed clear, simple language that anyone could understand. Starting today, every investment offer, every loan agreement, every financial contract in America will be automatically verified for fairness and legality before any money changes hands, Richard continued. Predatory lending becomes impossible. Hidden fees become impossible. Financial fraud becomes impossible. Lucy stood up in the gallery, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom. Mr. Sterling, show them the family protection protocol. Richard smiled at his cousin, his found family, his greatest blessing from this entire nightmare, and pressed another button. A new display appeared showing a virtual shield around every family's financial assets, automatically blocking any transaction that could lead to financial ruin. No family will ever again lose their home to hidden contract clauses, Richard announced. No retiree will ever again lose their savings to investment fraud. No young person will ever again be trapped by predatory student loans. The courtroom erupted in applause, but Richard wasn't finished. But this isn't just about protection, he said, his voice growing stronger. It's about opportunity. When people can trust the financial system, they're willing to invest, to start businesses, to take the risks that create prosperity for everyone. Carlos joined him at the podium, carrying a briefcase that contained the signed agreements from every major bank in America. Today, 47 financial institutions representing 89% of American consumer banking have agreed to implement the Sterling Protocol voluntarily. The rest will be required to comply by federal mandate within 60 days. Eleanor stepped forward with the final piece, a letter from the President of the United States, officially endorsing the new system and calling on other nations to follow America's lead. The age of financial predators is over, Richard declared. Today begins the age of financial justice. As the courtroom erupted in celebration, Richard felt a presence beside him that wasn't visible to anyone else. His father, James Sterling, finally at peace, knowing his son had completed the work he'd started 50 years ago. Lucy hugged him tightly as photographers captured the moment. "Your dad would be proud," she whispered. Richard looked out at the celebrating crowd, at the families who would never again face the terror he'd experienced, at a future where trust was built into the very foundation of commerce. "No," he said softly, hugging Lucy back. "Our dad would be proud." The Sterling Santos Financial Protection Network went live at exactly 3:47 p.m. Eastern Time. Within hours, it had prevented 47 attempted financial frauds and automatically flagged over 300 predatory loan attempts. Tomorrow really was better because they had made it better. And this was just the beginning.